There are no two countries as fundamentally linked as ours.
The President and I are truly grateful. We're truly grateful for your determination to see this agreement reached.
Mike Pence made his first official visit to the Capitol today as Vice President of the United States, and he had plenty to discuss with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, including ratification of the new NAFTA. But Trudeau also raised a far more controversial issue, the growing number of states restricting access to abortion. The CBC's Katie Simpson is here with more. Katie, we're going to get to those other subjects, but first let's talk about NAFTA and what was said in this meeting on that big trade deal.
Well, this was the whole point of this meeting, and that's what we've heard from both the Canadians and the Americans, that Mike Pence and Justin Trudeau were going to sit down to have a conversation about where both countries are in terms of the ratification process of the new NAFTA. Both countries want to ratify this deal. And Mike Pence promised, said that the Americans his administration is working to make this happen, and they're hopeful it could happen by this summer. Now, this meeting, as much as it is a closed-door meeting to have some conversation, there's a lot of optics going on here, and there's a lot of politics. Both leaders need to have some political cover to make this happen in their own countries. So Justin Trudeau, Mike Pence asked him to lean on his credibility as a progressive liberal to reach out to the Democrats to say, hey, if this deal is good enough for me because we have so much in common, it should be good enough for you. At the same time, Mike Pence saluted Justin Trudeau's toughness to try and give him some political cover against conservative attacks that Justin Trudeau was too weak in his dealings with Donald Trump. Have a listen.
We look to the U.S. Democrats to understand our significant improvements and our issues that, like Canadian Liberals, they care deeply about. So we are confident that the work being done on ratification is possible because we made sure that from multiple angles this was a better deal for Americans, for Canadians, and for Mexicans.
I saw your determination to drive a hard bargain for Canada, just as President Trump was driving a hard bargain for the United States of America.
Mike Pence said hard bargain, driving a hard bargain a couple of times at different photo ops throughout this event. So nothing is unplanned at these types of photo ops and these types of meetings. So certainly Mike Pence came to deliver a message to get some help from Justin Trudeau, and Justin Trudeau delivered a message to help get some help from Mike Pence. So it's very much a collaborative effort to try and get this NAFTA deal across the finish line.
Speaking of collaboration, a couple other areas that fit the bill for that. China, Venezuela, both discussed.
Yeah, and the Americans offered Mike Pence offered some of the strongest language we've heard from the Americans yet on China, saying that the Americans, first of all, condemned the arrest of the two Canadians who are being held by Beijing at this time, caught up in the diplomatic dispute. That's really a three-way diplomatic dispute between Washington, Ottawa, and Beijing over the arrest of the Huawei executive that happened in Canada at the request of the United States and has upset China. But with Mike Pence suggesting or hinting, his language wasn't 100% firm, but he suggested that when Donald Trump goes to the G20 next month in Japan, he's expected to have a meeting on the sidelines of that summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping. And Mike Pence suggested that the Americans will bring this up, even though the Americans are dealing with their own complex trade negotiations with China. This is something certainly Canada very much wants to have happen because the Canadians can't get the Chinese to return their calls. The other issue that came up was Venezuela. And even though they didn't see eye to eye, there was a spirit of politeness that seemed to emerge from this meeting, which there hasn't necessarily been with the change in tone of the Trump administration. Donald Trump is a disruptor. He's very blunt. Mike Pence, although he's very supportive of the president, he was quite diplomatic, quite polite. So there was an ask from the Americans for Canada to step in and say to Cuba, we don't want you to influence what's going on in Venezuela. He described Cuba as a malign force in dealing with the whole crisis in Venezuela. Justin Trudeau politely rebuffed and rejected that request from the Americans, saying that Canada has a completely different position here and that Canada sees Cuba could actually be helpful in this crisis.
Speaking of very different positions, abortion. We knew yesterday that the Prime Minister said it would be something he raised. There are a number of states, of course, that have recently introduced legislation that would restrict access to abortion. What happened?
Well, this certainly did not hit Mike Pence by surprise. By Justin Trudeau coming out yesterday to say, hey, of course, I'm going to raise this, it meant that he had time to prepare. And as I mentioned, this was a visit that went according to plan. There's no sort of curveball here that you might see if you have Donald Trump, because Donald Trump, very much from what we've seen in the past, reacts in ways you can't predict. But with Mike Pence, he knew this was coming. Justin Trudeau had said it publicly. We don't know to the extent that Justin Trudeau brought it up behind closed doors, but Mike Pence did not seem to be fazed when this issue came up in their private discussion.
We had a very respectful conversation on that issue, and I know the President appreciates the relationship that he has forged with Prime Minister Trudeau, and so do I. Look, friends can have differences of opinion and still be friends.
If you also take a look at the body language between Trudeau and Pence, they seem to be at ease with each other today and really trying to have a spirit of collaboration, or at least that's what they're trying to do. Whether it lasts, because there are so many unknowns in Washington, that is a bigger picture question that we all have to watch.
Always questions. Thanks, Katie. The CBC's Katie Simpson. So how is the government here viewing this meeting? Rob Oliphant is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He joins us from the foyer of the House of Commons. Hi, Mr. Oliphant. Great to see you.
Great to see you, Bashi.
I just want to start off on NAFTA. We just got something on the wires, wondering if you can help us understand it at all. It looks like the president has made a decision to send, according to the Post, send the draft statement of administrative action to Congress. Essentially, what it does is trigger the timeline, force Congress to act a bit quicker on the new NAFTA. Was there any indication that he planned to do that in the conversation between Vice President Pence and Prime Minister Trudeau?
The conversation between Vice President Pence and Mr. Trudeau was broad, and NAFTA was obviously a very important part of that conversation. Canada has taken every step. The government has been working to make sure that we're doing our part of the ratification process on time. So we had a Ways and Means motion that was presented on Tuesday. The Prime Minister presented legislation on Wednesday, and that will go through the usual process, and we'll be ready to ratify our parts. Obviously, Mexico has its ratification process, the U.S. has its, and we have ours.
Did Vice President Pence indicate that there would be some kind of mechanism used by the president to force the sort of hastening of the timeline on the U.S. side?
I wasn't in those meetings, obviously. I do know that this piece of legislation and the ratification of the agreement is important to all three countries. It's a win-win-win agreement, and so each country will take its ratification process seriously. We sense that there is a timeliness to it. We are wanting to make sure, because Canadians will benefit. This is a vastly improved agreement that Canadians will have access to the largest market in the world, and we'll continue to do that. And we're doing it while we've got safeguards for labor, for the environment, for Indigenous rights, and it's very important. So we're doing it.
I'm glad you brought that up, Mr. Oliphant, because that's something that the Prime Minister echoed in his press conference. Specifically, he brought up the more progressive elements of the deal, said that he wants Democrats in the U.S. to understand those elements and understand that it's, quote, a better deal. Are the Democrats, from your perspective, wrong to criticize the bill for not going far enough on those elements?
I think I've been in opposition, I've been in government. I know that there are, in any political process, there's going to be people who are trying to dig in on an issue. We'll let the Americans do their process. Congress has a role. The White House has a role. They will duke that out. What we know is that our Prime Minister and our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland, stood up for Canadians. They stood up for the progressive values that we're known for around the world, and we'll continue to do that. And they're embedded in this act in a way that makes it an improved treaty that will ensure Canadians continue to be prosperous.
Is anyone in the Canadian government reaching out to Democrats who have voiced those concerns?
The minister, Chrystia Freeland, has had conversations with Democrats. She's had conversations with
Ms. Pelosi, though?
Ms. Pelosi. She's had those conversations. Those are ongoing conversations. We understand that when people share our progressive values, those are important things to share. We'll let them do their process. That's for the Americans to engage in. They will be doing that on their own timeline. We know what we need to do in Canada, and that's stand up for Canadians and Canadian businesses.
I want to move on to China because there was a lot of talk about the 2 Canadians detained in that country in the meeting today, according to the press conference that the Vice President and Prime Minister gave. You just got back from a trip there. Did you raise the issue of those 2 Canadians, and with whom?
I raised it at every possible opportunity. I raised it. Our trip was a parliamentary trip, and so we were able to meet with officials, both at the province level, subnational level, as well as members of the National People's Congress. It was our top agenda. I had 2 main goals: was to raise concerns about Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig's conditions, and ensure that they understood that we accepted this as an arbitrary decision made by China. It is inappropriate, and it's we defended them. I also asked that we open the door for conversations. We're not the only country that's had difficulty in relationships with China from time to time. This is a little bit new for us. And what China does is it stops conversations. So I took every opportunity to open that door. I was disappointed the Conservatives were invited to send members of Parliament with us on the trip. They chose not to. We are taking every opportunity to stand up for those Canadians. And we're also doing it multilaterally. So what I really liked about the statement today with Vice President Pence and Prime Minister Trudeau was it added to that large voice of other countries in making our case. So we're not alone in this. And I think that Minister Freeland has done a good job of bringing in all the like-minded, but also people who may have differing views from Canada, to say we need to stand together to protect Canadians who travel and work abroad.
When you brought up that issue, as you say so frequently, what was the response you received?
It was difficult. No one likes to hear criticism of their government. I did it politely. I always try to be nice and polite, but I did it strongly. And in some of the conversations that were at lunchtime and more casual conversations, I continued to stress the fact that Madam Meng has been the subject of an extradition request from the United States. Canada is a country of rule of law. We are following due process. We are going through absolutely what we have to do to follow the way Canadians expect us to do a judicial process. So we're doing that, and we tried to explain that that's the system, and that what they've done by retaliation, whether it's on canola or on the detainment of Canadians, is simply unacceptable. That is not the way that China wants to be seen in the world. Their reputation is at stake, and we are gathering, and this is not megaphone diplomacy, we are gathering other countries in the world who are recognizing the importance of China. It's an important economic player, but human rights need to be brought up at every possible opportunity.
You're not the only Canadian politician to have recently traveled there. The Premier of Nova Scotia also just went to China, and he also hosted the Chinese ambassador in his province. He was asked, according to a spokesperson from Foreign Affairs, he was to be briefed at the very least on this. A spokesperson for the Premier says he did not raise the issue of the 2 Canadians detained at all. Should he have?
The Premier will make his own decisions. That's what he does. He makes his own decisions. I am personally, and I'm just speaking for myself, personally disappointed. Any Canadian, whether an elected official or anyone who knows people who have connections in China, who do business in China, universities, NGOs, anybody should be raising this issue. That's my personal opinion. I think I take every opportunity, and I would hope every Canadian would stand together in solidarity for the issues of human rights. That's what our government's about, and we're about it because that's what Canadians are about.
What does it say, though, that Minister Freeland, as she said on a CBC radio show last week, can't even get her call returned by her counterpart?
Well, the reality is that China has its way of doing things. We are trying. I opened that door. I took the opportunity as a parliamentary secretary at the request of Minister Freeland to go on that trip. It was an opportunity for Canada to open the door where we could, to have a conversation where we could. The ultimate goal of that trip was to raise the issues of human rights, whether it was about Uyghurs who were detained, whether it was about Tibet. We raised all of those important issues that Canadians are concerned about, and I did it respectfully but strongly. And my ultimate question for them was to open the door. Our Prime Minister is ready to talk at any time to President Xi. Our Minister is available to talk to her counterpart, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, at any time. Senior officials are available to talk. We're ready to talk. It's not, the ball is in their court at this time.
Has the Prime Minister requested to speak with the President?
The Minister of Foreign Affairs is managing this issue. That is her job, and when the time is right.
But you were expressly told that the Prime Minister was willing to talk to the President to deliver that message.
I have been told several times, and the Prime Minister has made it very clear he is always willing to talk, to open the door. He wants to stand with Canadian farmers, whether it's about canola or pork, and to stand with detained Canadians in very, very difficult circumstances.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. Appreciate your time today. That's Rob Oliphant, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you.
The United States today renews our call on the Chinese government to release the 2 Canadian citizens who have been wrongfully detained for the last 6 months without due process of law. We stand with Canada in this cause, and we will continue to until your citizens are restored. We know you will not be intimidated by the use of coercive tactics, and neither will we.
The U.S. extended a show of solidarity for Canada today as this country spars with China. During his trip to Ottawa, U.S. Vice President Mike Pence urged China to release the 2 Canadians detained in that country since December. But Pence and the Prime Minister didn't see exactly eye to eye on another file, Venezuela, and particularly Cuba's influence on that nation's crisis. Ben Rosewell is Canada's former ambassador to Venezuela, now president of the Canadian International Council. He joins us from Toronto. Hi, Mr. Rosewell. Great to see you again.
Yeah, always a pleasure to be here, Vashi.
So I want to get to China and, of course, Venezuela, but let me just start off with the general tone, the sort of product of these meetings, especially what you make of, I guess, what a lot of people are writing about and talking about since this press conference between the two men, in that the Prime Minister came out and sort of directly appealed to Democrats in saying, you know, there's a lot of good stuff in this bill, that our values are similar, in this agreement, our values are similar, that progressive stuff is good, you should think it's good too. I'm paraphrasing, but you know what I mean. What do you read into that?
So I think today you saw what a normal Canada-U.S. relationship should look like, which is somewhat transactional. We help them on issues that are important to them. They help us on issues that are important to us. They need to get NAFTA through the Congress and to leverage the credibility that Justin Trudeau has as a progressive in the United States. Serves the purposes of the Trump administration. And likewise, we really need some help with our 2 Canadian citizens that have been arbitrarily detained in China. And so you see the Vice President doing that. This is the way it should look like. I think the surprising thing is that it really hasn't looked like this for most of the Trump administration. We should welcome it while it's good, but also recognize that this could go down, this could go south any moment as soon as Trump changes his mind.
That explicit show of solidarity around the 2 Canadians detained in China, how meaningful do you think it is to have that voice added to the sort of chorus of calls that this is wrong, especially the voice from the United States? Does it help or hurt the cause?
I don't think it's going to accelerate the release of Michael Spavor or Michael Kovrig. But that said, it is a welcome development. This is something that's important for Canada. We are in this tiff with China because we are a country of laws and we're a country of treaties, and we have those treaties, and in this case with the United States. We're being punished for being faithful to our treaty allies and standing up for the rule of law. And so because we're being punished by China essentially for being close to the United States, it's very welcome to have the Vice President of the United States stand shoulder to shoulder with us.
He condemned the detainment of the 2 Canadians and urged for their release, but he did not do what the president had done a few months ago in that sort of tie the detainment of Meng Wanzhou, or the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, to the trade dispute between the United States and China. He was asked even explicitly, you know, would you sort of remove that extradition order in exchange for something else? And he didn't even acknowledge that question. What does it say to you that he wouldn't go where the president did?
Well, that he's perhaps a bit more intelligent in the conduct of foreign policy than the president. That was a disastrous move, not only for Canada, suffering the consequences of this loyalty to the United States, but also undermine the credibility of the United States itself as a country of laws and a country of treaties. So Pence handled it the way that I think a senior U.S. official should, by dealing with this as an isolated case of China arbitrarily detaining foreign nationals simply because it has a political difference of opinion with its own, its capital. Now, in this case, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig are not only a symbol of how vulnerable Canadians might be in China, but really representatives of any democratic country. If people that are innocent can be arrested and thrown in jail merely because of a political dispute between the two countries, that's a problem not just for Canada, not just for the United States, but really for the entire world.
Do you think there's any way, though, and I totally take your point that they're separate issues, but because the president has raised the specter of them being tied, do you think there's any way this issue, the issue of the two Canadians detained, is impacted by trade talks between the U.S. and China? Is there any way they sort of cross lanes again?
Well, the only linkage I could see is that the trade war between the United States and China is getting worse and not better. That seems to be influencing the U.S. perception of its need for its allies, recognizing the strategic importance of Canada, and trying to remove some of the irritants in the bilateral trade agenda. So recently we saw the elimination of those outrageous steel tariffs. We're now seeing a renewed push to get NAFTA signed, and now you have the Vice President coming to Ottawa to speak out in favor. They've been doing us a number of favors and really trying to repair some of the damage in the relationship between Canada and the United States. And the timing might be explained by the fact that the U.S. and China are actually drifting farther apart and engaging in greater strategic rivalry than before.
I have to ask you about Venezuela as well, and the main sort of point at which our country and the U.S. seemed to split, at least in the press conference that followed the meeting of the Vice President and the Prime Minister, was on Cuba and the potential for Cuba to act as some sort of intermediary or maybe lesser than that capacity, but have some sort of role. The Prime Minister said, obviously, the position of the U.S. was different than Canada on that. What do you make of that?
Well, we do actually have quite different positions on Venezuela. We do share a support for the elected National Assembly, the last remaining democratic body in Venezuela, in its struggle to restore the Constitution and restore democracy. But the difference is that Canada prefers to use democratic means and diplomatic means to support the return of democracy, whereas the United States is prepared to use military and, frankly, undemocratic means, the use of force to try and...
Well, they've said it's not off the table. They haven't said they're going to use it.
There's been a repeated reference to that threat, and it runs contrary to the goal of actually emancipating the Venezuelan people, of giving them the choice, not foreign soldiers the choice, but the Venezuelan citizens themselves the choice of who their government is.
Do you think they would ever make good on that?
There doesn't seem to be a serious military mobilization, so it does seem more likely that it's empty posturing at this point. And of course, it's probably helping Maduro more than it's hurting them, in that it's causing some closing of the ranks of the military around Maduro. The one thing that all people wearing a Venezuelan military uniform believe is that they have a duty to repel a foreign invasion. And so threatening that actually is probably helping continue Maduro in power. I don't think it would have been very politic for our Prime Minister to disagree publicly with the U.S. On that in a press conference, but I would be surprised if that kind of message wasn't passed behind closed doors.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Rosewell. Great to have you back on the show. That's Ben Rosewell, former ambassador to Venezuela, now president of the Canadian International Council. He joined us from Toronto.
The president and I are absolutely determined to work with rank and file in the Congress and the leadership to move the USMCA forward and to move it forward this summer. We remain confident that the USMCA will receive broad-based support in the Congress if it's brought to the floor.
There were a number of Canadian conservative politicians who questioned our desire to include strong provisions on the environment, strong provisions on labor, strong provisions on gender and Indigenous issues. These are integral parts of what makes it a better deal, and they are significant things that we look to the U.S. Democrats to understand our significant improvements and our issues that, like Canadian Liberals, they care deeply about.
U.S. Vice President Mike Pence touted the new NAFTA deal today in Ottawa, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau took the opportunity to message U.S. Democrats on what the deal includes that might speak to their supporters. Can the Trump administration deliver on its pledge to push the deal through this summer? And what has to happen here to make the new NAFTA a reality in Canada? Time for the Power Panel. In Vancouver, Marcella Monroe of KTG Public Affairs. Hill and Knowlton's Melissa Landsman joins us from Toronto. Here with me in studio, Christine McMillan of Crestview Strategy and the Canadian Press's Mia Rabson. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. Mia, let's start with the meeting itself. Everybody came out, lots of nice things said. Mike Pence said, hey, we're probably going to get this done in the summer. And it was kind of a little bit odd to hear that because of all the opposition. And then we find out a few minutes later that the president, in fact, plans to trigger a process in Congress to make that happen, essentially, which will likely anger the Democrats. They had kind of warned him not to do that.
They did, and there's, the Democrats are already pretty angry at Donald Trump, so anything else
you don't say, yeah.
Certainly, the domestic politics on both sides of the border are playing a role in this bill, although it seems less likely that the concerns on this side of the border are going to cause problems getting the bill passed, getting it ratified. The big question, of course, is the Democrats in the United States, and that's who Trudeau, I think, was speaking to today on the sort of the progressive side and saying, you know what, it's actually pretty good. We made some improvements, so let's not abandon this deal.
Do you think, Christine, that message would be received by Democrats? I mean, there's a lot more at play than just the substance of their concerns. There's a political dynamic in the United States between Democrats and the president.
That's just it. And I think that's what the Prime Minister was trying to give them some cover, perhaps, right? To say, listen, we're progressive, you're progressive. There's some good things here, and let's get it through. We need to ratify it, for our country, for your country. Let's find some common ground. Maybe give them some comfort. That, well, he thinks it's okay. He's one of the most progressive world leaders there is, and maybe it's okay for us to be okay with it too.
Melissa, do you think that kind of messaging will work?
Well, I'm not sure that it works, and I'm not going to sit here and say that nobody wants or the Conservatives don't want a NAFTA deal. But the questions still remain about this deal, and I'm going to say that I'm a bit cynical, but this might be a domestic election play to get this done before the next elections. But at the end of the day, if NAFTA is an issue, which I imagine that it won't be, Justin Trudeau is going to have to explain why we can't export as many cars and why our medications might cost more, or why the U.S. has complete authority over any deals that we might negotiate in the future. And he's going to have to explain to Canadians why this is a better deal, and I think the answer is it's not.
Do you agree, Marcella? I mean, on the car, I take your point, Melissa, on the cars. I mean, I think you're referring to the quota that they agreed to,
right.
which experts say is so high that it's, even people from the auto industry so far have said that it won't be met. But I do take your point. And also, to be fair, on the steel tariffs, they were removed, but there's that surge level that was never defined either.
That's right.
Marcella, what do you think?
Well, I guess my curiosity with what Melissa just said is I don't really know what option the government of Canada had. When President Trump was elected, NAFTA renegotiating, opening up this agreement was a major promise, and he wasn't about to back down from that. So, look, I think the deal is as good as we were going to get, regardless of who the Prime Minister was. I think that the Canadian government did the right thing by having, broad help from a variety of political voices around their NAFTA panel. And I think now we have to wait and see whether Trump, who's been being backed into a corner sort of day by day on the Mueller report, is going to have the wherewithal to get this through a democratically controlled Congress. As my colleague Brian Topp, who was on that panel, said to me earlier today, he said, is there a Democrat in this election cycle that's willing to take up the cause of NAFTA? And I think that's a pretty good question. At the end of the day, I think what we don't want to see is to back President Trump into a corner, or to see the Democrats do that in a way where he abrogates NAFTA, because that could be the worst case scenario for, I think, Canada.
It's an interesting question around the situation in the United States. What is the calculation for the Democrats?
Well, and right now it's important to note that we still do have a trade agreement with the United States. We have the existing NAFTA, which the government has said several times, we're not abandoning that if this doesn't get ratified right away. But this is definitely Trudeau appealing to the Democrats, saying, this is an issue I need to get a win at home. These are issues that are important to me. And he's trying to sort of get above and beyond those American domestic politics, which have been at play through the entirety of these negotiations and have caused problems for them throughout, because Trump isn't just negotiating with Canada. He's trying to get a win over the Democrats himself.
Christine, let me ask you about another issue that came up out of this meeting, and that's China. And we heard very explicitly Mike Pence, the vice president, stand in solidarity with Canada on the two detained Canadians. And for everyone watching, that's Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. Those are the two men who were detained in China following the arrest of Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou back in December in Vancouver. That very much angered China. These two men have been detained for months now. Mike Pence sort of speaking out and saying, you know, we stand with Canada, they should be released. Do you think that changes anything?
Yeah, I think it changes something. I think that I think Canadians and Americans have always kind of stood together on this issue, and I think that the fact that they brought it to the forefront during these negotiations, I think that's meaningful for sure.
We had Melissa Rob Oliphant on the show off the top, who's the parliamentary secretary to Chrysler Freeland. He actually just returned from China, and he said something that I found interesting because I know you'll remember that Conservatives, when this dispute started, were calling on the Prime Minister to say, pick up the phone, talk to your counterpart in China, and he said the Liberals refused. They said it wasn't the time for that. That you know, a number of strategists were saying things like on the show, like, oh, it would sort of be your last card to play, that type of thing. And Mr. Oliphant said that when he went there and he met with a number of people there, he raised this issue all the time, and he said that the Prime Minister was willing to talk to the President, which of course we hadn't heard from this government prior. I'm wondering what you think of that.
Well, the question is whether the Chinese president was willing to talk to the prime minister, and I think the answer on that one is no. But you know, this goes further, and we would expect Rob Oliphant to go and raise this at every opportunity. There are two Canadians there that are imprisoned, frankly, for no apparent reason. So, you know, all of that said, that doesn't change the fact that the government doesn't have a strategy on China, and they would be very lucky if the president at the G20 later this month raised this with the Chinese. And I think there's domestic politics both at play. I think the Americans' relationship with frankly with China is drifting, and well, we frankly don't have a China strategy. So anything that would get these two free would be good.
Marcella, given the apparent unwillingness of anyone in China to return, you know, either the request of the Prime Minister or the calls of the Foreign Minister, is the best hope what might happen at the G20? And Mike Pence referenced it, that the President might try to talk to the President of China.
Well, I think that's an excellent point. I also think the G20 is an even broader opportunity. Listen, I think one of the things that's a bit surprising to me after all this time with these two Canadians being, you know, stuck in a Chinese prison, essentially, is that the federal government here isn't making more of an issue on this on the world stage day by day. We kind of saw a bit of that louder, if you will, diplomacy at the beginning of this. We haven't really seen that since. So I'm hopeful that the Canadian government should go into the G20, you know, assuming that this situation hasn't resolved itself by then, and really look to all of their partners of the G20 to help them in putting some pressure on China, because I think they are being a bit too quiet about it.
I highlighted to the Vice President that there was a significant amount of concern amongst Canadians on the new anti-choice laws being passed in a number of American states, and highlighted that Canadians, and indeed this government, will always be a staunch defender of women's rights and a woman's right to choose. It was a cordial conversation, but it is one on which we have very different perspectives.
But let me be clear, I'm very proud to be part of a pro-life administration, and our administration has taken steps to stand for the sanctity of life at home and abroad.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said he would bring up the recent attempts in the United States to restrict access to abortion in some states. And as you heard, he did. We're back with the Power Panel. Marcella Monroe, Melissa Lantsman, Christine McMillan, and Mia Robson. The Prime Minister had said yesterday that he would bring it up in the meeting, and as we mentioned, he did. What do you make, Christine, of what they said coming out of the meeting on it?
Well, for one, I'm glad the Prime Minister brought it up. I think he's got a track record of bringing up difficult conversations with world leaders, and I think it's important that he raised it. I mean, they were obviously cordial about it. They're not on the same side, but I think it's important that the Prime Minister is raising it and making sure that
Why? Why is it important?
Well, it's important. It's such an important issue, right? As we watch this backslide in the U.S., it's personally, I'm fearful that we start to see the same type of thing here in Canada. I mean, conservative politicians are taking positions of power across the country, and I think, whenever there's an opening on the debate, they seem to sort of jump in. They say often you hear.
How so? Like, are they pledging to change the laws at all?
Well, you hear conservative leaders often say things along the lines of, I won't reopen this debate. They always, I think everyone in my recent memory I can think of saying that. But then you look to members of their caucus, for example, in Ontario, we have Sam Oosterhoff from the Niagara region, who doesn't even have a hidden agenda about it. He has a very public agenda saying what he thinks that women, shouldn't have that right. You shouldn't have that right to choose. So I think it's important that the Prime Minister raises it.
How problematic for the Conservatives, Melissa, is this?
I don't think it's problematic at all because I don't think it's a debate here. And no matter how many times the Prime Minister brings it up with vice presidents of different countries, it's still not a debate in Canada because, Mr. Scheer was clear on it. He wasn't going to open up the debate. It's not a debate. And frankly, these things are addressed in the U.S. or discussed in the U.S. all the time, and they don't come to Canada.
What about Christine's point that the leadership of the party, for example, will say, we're not reopening the debate, we're not going to legislate on this, but then you see certain MPs or MPPs who are very vocal about their position.
And I actually respect those people's views on the issue of being pro-life. But at the end of the day, it's about what we legislate in this country and what we talk about, and that comes from the leader and that comes from the government agenda. So this isn't a debate, no matter how much we want to make it one on this TV show.
Marcella, fair point.
No, it is a debate. It's a debate because there are very well-funded and well-organized organizations in this country, similar and related to the organizations in the United States, who are adamantly against a woman's right to choice when it comes to their reproductive freedom, and that those people have been active and aggressively helping to get people nominated in conservative parties across this country to run and be successful. Now, it's fine. I also agree that people are allowed to have any opinion they want. I'm frankly glad that we are now getting to know more of the people in the conservative parties that are against a woman's right to choose so that the electorate can act accordingly. But these rights are not written in stone. And these conservative politicians that are going to take those views, it's not just good enough to say to us, I'm not going to bring it up. It's not
Does that mean you can't elect people with those views?
No, it means Canadians have a right to know, like they do about many of the issues that our politicians take a stand on, what those people's views are. If they want to elect them, that's fine. Those people have a right to sit in Parliament. They have a right to march in their anti-choice rallies. But what they don't have a right to do is to tell us this isn't a debate and to tell Canadian women that they shouldn't be concerned when more of these people are getting elected and when this movement is very aggressively pushing, again, not just south of the border, but north of the border.
Mia, let's try to take some of the partisanship out of this, but just from from our perspective, we are watching, regardless of whether it's on this TV show or not. It's also in Parliament. We saw, for example, and I'll play the clip in a second, but a Bloc MP basically ask for unanimous consent on a motion about abortion. Actually, I'll play that right now, and then we'll talk about it.
That the House of Commons reiterates that a woman's body belongs to her and to her alone, and recognize her right to choose an abortion regardless of the reason.
So there was some traction on that. We know that Andrew Scheer's been asked about it recently. He said the exact same thing that Christine mentioned. I'm not going to legislate on this. I'm not reopening the debate. But we also know that there are questions about a number of MPs who appeared at, for example, the March for Life. And then we've got scenes like this, which I imagine will continue to play out.
Absolutely. I mean, the government does see this as something that's playing well for them domestically. And I will say, just sort of from my own views on what's happening in the United States and what I see from my friends, my family, this is something they're talking about as well. Whether or not they're concerned it's going to happen in Canada, they are talking about what's happening in the United States. So it is an issue that it's on their mind. They are concerned about it. And that is something that the Liberals are definitely trying to play into. The motion yesterday came in from a Bloc MP. The Liberals were thrilled, of course, to be able to stand up. It was a lengthy ovation. They considered say. And look, the Conservatives didn't even stand up to applaud for this. So clearly they have a hidden agenda. It's something that the Liberals have worked very hard to, and it's an issue that they think they have some traction on. When it comes to Andrew Scheer, he's been clear, even when he was elected as a leader, people said, well, you kind of won that leadership with the social conservative candidates throwing their support to you. What are you going to do about that? Are you going to have to give in on any of these issues? And he's been pretty clear from that point forward. Not an issue that he thinks is going to be reopened under his watch as Prime Minister. The Liberals aren't going to stop saying that they don't necessarily believe that.
Do you think this is partly strategy, Christine?
No, I don't think so. I think this issue is too important, and I think that Americans probably didn't think a year ago that they'd be where they are either, watching all these states start to backslide on women's rights. So I think it's important to raise it, and I think Canadians deserve to know where people stand on something this important.
Melissa, what do you think?
Look, I think that Andrew Scheer has been clear. He's not going to reopen the debate. I've been in the Conservative Party as a pro-choice woman my entire life, and I've never been afraid of this debate coming to Parliament, because at the end of the day, the leader makes decisions about the government agenda. And if this wasn't posturing, then Justin Trudeau would have brought up the death penalty, because they have that in Alabama too. But that wasn't the case. This is a complete play for a domestic audience, and it's fear-mongering on an issue that doesn't exist as legislation by a potential government in October.
Marcella, last word to you.
Well, there's a history of great pro-choice women in the Conservative Party, and I hope more of them, like Melissa, will continue to speak out. But I think that this is something that we still have to keep on mind. It's an issue that I've been concerned about since I was a teenager, and I'd be happy to go back to being more concerned about it if the situation changes in Canada.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.